everyone, this is Alicia Evans, the Animal Healer, and this is our In Sync with Animals interview series. Now, I told you this year I'm going to be coming out of the closet talking about all of the different connections that I've been making from the energy background and putting the science to exactly what I've been seeing, what the dogs have been showing me in this holistic dog training field. So today I am over the top excited because our interview today is with Dr. Dodds, and Dr. Jean is really, in my opinion, is a legend among veterinarians because she's not just a veterinarian, but she's a veterinary researcher. And that lays a lot of groundwork and a lot of credibility for me because she was looking at the things that she's probably taught and told as a veterinarian, but just sort of started seeing that certain things weren't fully adding up. So I'm going to give you her bio, and I'm going to read it because it's well worth hearing and introducing. So W.G. Dodds is a doctor of veterinary medicine who became a veterinarian in 1964 after graduating from the Ontario Veterinary College, and has spent 5 decades in clinical hematology and immunology research and diagnostic veterinary pathology. So this woman knows what she speaks. Okay, from 1965 to 1986, she was a member of the National and International Committees on Hematology, Animal Models of Human Disease, Veterinary Medicine, and Laboratory Animal Science. Dr. Dodds was a grantee of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute at NIH, and has over 150 research publications. She started HemoPet in 1986, first nonprofit national animal blood bank. And today, HemoPet's range of nonprofit services include educational activities and provide canine blood components and related services, adopting retired greyhound blood donors as companions, and the HemoLife Diagnostic Division, focused on hematology and blood banking, immunology, endocrinology, nutrition, and holistic medicine. And you can visit them at www.hemo.org. She is also the co-trustee of the Rabies Challenge Fund, a not-for-profit project to assess the duration and immunity and the safety of current rabies vaccines for animals. And that you can find at www.rabieschallengefund.org. Most recently, she served on the board of directors of the American Holistic Veterinary Medical Association and is currently on the board of the American Veterinary Medical Foundation. She's a member of the editorial committee for the American Holistic Veterinary Medical Association Journal. She's written 2 popular award-winning pet health books together with Diana Laverdure and holds 25 patents. Dr. Jean, seriously, I have goosebumps on my goosebumps, and I'm really, really excited to interview you because what you know, you don't know because you read someone else's clinical papers. In some cases, maybe, but for the things that you have done and the things that you have been contributing to the veterinary medical world, you've been doing the research. And that's huge because there's not a ton of independent research when it comes to assessing issues that are happening with our animals. So thank you so much for being willing to come aboard and share your interview with Animals.
You're welcome. The problem is when you've been doing it for 5 decades, of course you have a long resume. You've done it for a long time.
But I'm okay with reading a long resume for you because, like I said, give credit where credit is due. So,
Thank you. You're very kind.
Well, I'm not trying to be kind. I'm being very honest because when I came upon your work, I was so excited because much of our world today, we have 2 factions. We have the faction that's totally science oriented. We have the faction that's going a little more alternative oriented. And then, we have a middle ground. But a lot of times the science that we're receiving it isn't fully independently validated science. So when I started seeing certain things in my holistic dog training practice that the dogs were showing me, like about collars and what could be damaged and different pieces, that I thought, look, I mean, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a doctor, but I am a body worker, and I do understand the physiological functioning of some of these aspects of the body and what could happen. To come across your research was just like this huge light bulb, because nobody was talking about this. And I know one of the reasons that I landed up going into becoming a holistic dog trainer was because of issues I had with my own chocolate lab. And I kept seeing through our training process, when I was told to use harsher and harsher tools, intuitively I knew it didn't feel right. It wasn't until later, till I started understanding the physiology, where I was like, you know, there could be a problem here. But then to see your research on it, it just so validated, you know, what my body was understanding. So before we even get into the thyroid piece, could we talk about what was your passion and how did you even come upon veterinary medicine?
That's pretty interesting. My late father was a physician who trained in surgery in Dalhousie University in Halifax. And then he decided there weren't very many people. He was going to go out to the Orient, where he was born. His family were medical missionaries in the Orient. And I was actually born in Shanghai. So, and we got the last boat out before the Japanese occupied Shanghai, and I would not have survived. But anyway, what my father decided when he went back up to the Orient was nobody needed a hand surgeon. They were dying of public health from dysentery and typhoid and, you know, unsanitary conditions. So we went back to North America and graduated with a special degree in public health from Johns Hopkins. Went back to the Orient and became the public health officer there, and then eventually went back to Canada as director of Indian and Eskimo affairs for the Canadian government. Now what happened was, I decided that I loved animals and I wanted to learn about them. And my father said, no, you're my oldest daughter. You're going to be a doctor like I am. I said, no, I'm going to be a veterinarian. And he said, oh, it was your great aunt, Dorothy, that had their monkeys and they lived in China and they were naturalists and whatever, that changed your mind. I said, no, I'm going to be a veterinarian. So he took me to the Ontario Veterinary College in about 1959, when women, by the way, were not welcomed in the profession, to show me that veterinary medicine was just bunches of things, couldn't possibly be science-oriented. How could we know the anatomy and physiology of all the different species when they spent all their lives just studying one? And of course, being a brat, I looked at him, I said, because we're smarter than you are, Dad. And finally, he said, okay, I'm going to start asking you questions. And he would point at, you know, different parts of his body and say, what's the nerves, what's the veins, what's the arteries? And I would tell him. He said he was amazed. He said, okay, you can be a veterinarian. So that's what happened.
And what did you think you're going to go into veterinary medicine for and do? And how did that over time, how did it start to shift to you doing research?
Well, because I won a special scholarship because of my academic standing, in order to get in as a woman, you had to graduate with perfect scores. Today, I would be terrified. I didn't even worry about it. I was going to be a veterinarian. I didn't care. I just did my thing. But what happened was I needed a job for the summer, and I wasn't going to take any money from my parents. I was going to do it myself. So I did medical illustrations and dog grooming during my time to earn enough money to pay for my tuition. The job I got was at the agricultural station where they had animal models of human disease, dogs with bleeding diseases like hemophilia. And the person who was in charge of that research station was a classmate of my father's at Johns Hopkins, because he was a veterinarian who took a public health degree at the same time as my father. So for the first time in my life, I used nepotism to get the job.
I'm sure your father loved that.
So I got the job, and then I decided I would dedicate my life to studying animal models of human disease, of bleeding and immunological and hematological diseases, non-invasively. In other words, these were animals born with genetic defects, and I studied their blood and their physiology. And I even got on the cover of a Lab Mammal Care magazine with a little Shih Tzu with hemophilia on my shoulder, saying how wonderful animal research could be. And I got a lot of backlash from biomedical scientists that said, but we can't do the kinds of studies you do. We have to induce disease in rats and mice and whatever to study what we want to study. So what you're doing is wonderful, but it makes us look bad or badly.
Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, I know. And I was shocked. I didn't expect that, response. So from there, I just continued. And then I moved the colony of animals from Canada to the United States when the NIH didn't fund Canadian research at the same level, which is correct, with US taxpayers' dollars. So I moved to the States in 1965. Then I met Charles and moved to California in 1986. That's how we started Hemopan.
This all should be in your bio. Because I didn't know all of these different aspects. And it's so fascinating because, number one, I love the fact that you were like, woman or not, I'm going to veterinary college. So, it's that like everything that you've done has always been on the cutting edge and the pioneering aspect of saying, you can judge gender all you want. I'm here to do what I'm here to do. And this is what I've chosen to do, and I'm doing it. So,
well, there's been a book actually called Women in Science, when I'm one of the people in there years ago. And there's also a book for children called I Want to Be a Veterinarian, and I'm in that one also.
I love it.
But some time ago now.
Yeah, but I'm saying it's like these were aspects, like even though I know about you, I know about your work, I know about your pioneering aspects, I didn't know all of those places that you went into to walk this path. And I think that's like, thank you for having the courage and the intuitiveness or the passion to do it. So how did you, one of the things that also totally blew me away about your work was when I found out about the rabies challenge, because I just, it was always something in my gut. It was like, well, medicine tells you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. And I started to see some of the research, and it started making me a little curious. So were you doing the immunology research before you came upon the thyroid piece, or how did those, well,
they all sort of gelled together. I was concerned about vaccines since about 1980, 81, 82. I was in charge of the blood program for humans for the state of New York, regulating it when AIDS and blood safety became a big issue. And that same time, we were worried about vaccinations. And it was absolutely heretic for me to stand up at veterinary meetings and talk about the concerns with parvovirus disease and the vaccines causing bone marrow failure and whatever, which was happening in people as well. And so because I was involved in the human hematology, immunology community, I knew about this research in people with rodent parvoviruses that were like the human one, as it turned out. And so when I talked at veterinary meetings about it, people were either totally amazed or furious. And we had places where the fire marshals had to come and evict people from the room because they were sitting on the floors and standing room only. And we were right. And people said, darn it, I can't stand it. But you know what? Wait 10 years and she'll be right. I wasn't doing anything. I was just reporting the observations that I saw, and I knew we had to figure out what caused it. And that was what led me to do this research.
Wow. So
why the thyroid? Because the thyroid is the master gland that controls everything. And I realized that you couldn't get proper blood results and immune function unless the thyroid was working properly. And I realized that nobody was studying this properly. So I came to it with a completely different viewpoint. I didn't have a prejudice. I didn't have tunnel vision. I had, the thyroid gland is a master gland. I'm going to study a much broader perspective of it. And that's why Diana and I wrote our award-winning book in 2011 called The Canine Thyroid Epidemic. And in that book, we described all the things that we now know today. And we were given an award as the best dog healthcare book for that year. Totally not realizing that this was such a pioneering effort.
Totally pioneering. And it's, I love it because you didn't go, this is what I'm looking for. You went, aha, I didn't even suspect this. But again, you are not biasing it with human, preconceived notion of what you would find. It
Right.
showed itself to you.
Right.
So what are in today's world with I mean, we've got 1 in 2 dogs are getting cancer. That's
Right.
a pretty high rate. At that
Right.
point I go, are we not facing an epidemic?
Mm-hmm.
So what role does the thyroid play in the body? So the average person would go to the vet and say, look, my dog's having, this issue or that issue. What's going to make the vet check the thyroid? What conditions would people want to know? If your dog is experiencing XYZ, you want to have the thyroid looked at. And are all thyroid panels equivalent? I mean, are there differences in thyroid panels that people want to know what they need to get checked?
See, part of the problem is that the veterinarians have not been taught this properly when they were students or even in their graduate continuing education. And so what happens over and over and over again is the client sees that her own companion animal is not behaving the way it used to with the family. Phobic, anxious, behaviorally erratic, chewing and licking its feet, having chronic yeasty ears, having anal glands that don't express themselves normally, having skin that's a little bit, irritated, dermatitis, and a hair coat that isn't soft but sticky uppy, or dry and fluffy where the feathering is. And then, of course, this continues to progress. So they don't feel their animal's right. They go to their veterinarian, and the veterinarian often will say, your dog's too young, Mrs. Jones, to have a thyroid problem. Let's just do a routine, chemical stuff and an examination. And of course, they never look at the thyroid, and it continues to progress. The problem is that classical signs of thyroid disease that they're looking for, which is fat, lazy, hates the cold, that kind of thing, doesn't occur until more than 70% of the thyroid gland has been inactivated. So in the interim period, early changes are happening. And the thyroid doesn't wake up tomorrow and say, I don't think I'm going to work anymore. It has to progress. One of the first things they see is subtle weight gain. The veterinarian is sure that Mrs. Jones is overfeeding the pet. Mrs. Jones is not overfeeding the pet. So that's the one thing. And then you have these chronic other conditions I mentioned. And then finally, they come home one day, they greet the dog at the door, and the dog jumps on the throat of one of the people in the hallway. Or you're sleeping, you're watching TV at night, the pet is sleeping beside you on the sofa, you reach down just to comfort or pet the dog, and it bites you on the hand viciously. These animals are startled. Their brains are not working normally. They feel unsure of themselves. They run by the laundry room to go into the backyard, and they see a towel hanging out of the hamper. They go berserk. What's that white thing hanging outside the hamper? Why is it there? It's going to come and get me. Or they're obsessive compulsive. They're going to take the toy away from a child. They hide under the coffee table. They won't come out. So there's all these strange things, which of course socially mean that many of those animals might go to pounds and shelters and be euthanized.
Right.
Because nobody's tested them.
A place where people might even go to a dog trainer and say, my dog is changing, and the dog trainer is going to go, well, let's positively reinforce this and let's give the treat. But the reality is the root of the issue
has not been identified.
Exactly.
Correct.
Well, so question, what are you starting to see in terms of ages?
It used to be a decade ago, the average clinically hypothyroid, even an early stage dog, was 3.5, 4.5, 5 years of age. Now it starts at puberty, 1 year, 1.5 years. That's where it begins. And by the time they're 2 or 3, they have full-blown hypothyroidism. The problem is it's not diagnosed properly because all of the reference ranges apply to adult dogs of every breed, from toy breed to St. Bernard, which is ridiculous.
What are you seeing as some of the common or consistent root causes of this? Like, what's changed in the last 10 years?
Well, first of all, you have genetic predisposition.
Okay.
So as we line breed and we inbreed and we select from these breed types that we've developed for the last 100 years, we're producing more genetic similarity. So unlike people where we tend to marry randomly or mate randomly, these pets don't, even if they're mixed breeds. The mixed breeds are hybrids. They're bringing more, the background for both breeds or three breeds to the table. For example, the latest designer dog. Are you ready for this?
I don't even want to know.
Golden Mountain Doodle.
What's that?
It's a golden retriever, standard poodle, Bernese mountain dog cross.
So I have a question with these breeds, these designer breeds.
Excuse me.
Basically, it's a mutt. I mean, seriously, just because of the fact
but that's not really true. We created all these breeds by selection. None of those breeds existed. They were selected for. You know, the Cocker Spaniel was selected with my own Brucey, and then they had to separate it for the English Cocker Spaniel by selecting for a different body type and a longer ear and whatever. So all the breed types that we have are fixed now in our phenotypic desire, but we aren't thinking about what's happening. Meanwhile, we're depleting the ozone layer. We're polluting the earth. The sun is giving horrible rays, and we get all of these pollutants damaging a genome that's already genetically susceptible to dysfunction, whether it be thyroid or diabetes or adrenal glands or whatever, you know, anything, or the brain. So then what? Sorry. So then we've done, we add vaccine after vaccine after vaccine. We add chemicals. We add heartworm, flea, and tick preventives. We put fertilizers with Roundup in them, glyphosate, in the ground. It's leaching into the water.
Totally.
We're damaging our whole world, and you and I are being damaged as well.
Totally. And then what about in terms of the dog foods? Like I'm totally fine with science, okay? But when science says, okay, now we're going to do grain-free foods. Well, grain-free isn't actually natural to a wild diet, and neither is kibble. So the constitution of the foods being fed are one thing. Now they have all this grain-free food, which is supposed to be healthier, and yet when we look at the actual statistics, 1 in 2 dogs are getting cancer. So how do we kind of balance this equation with saying we're using valid science, yet we're not actually checking our own statistics? Because if we were checking our own statistics, we'd have to go back to the drawing board and say, well, what's the root of the problem here?
Yeah, well, grain-free isn't the key. Gluten-free is the key. Okay. Because the protein in glutens, that's oatmeal, rye, barley, wheat, spelt, kamut, and couscous, as examples, has a protein called gliadin in it. Okay. Gliadin. Gliadin is the protein that looks like the thyroid hormone. And when we feed these glutens, we damage the thyroid gland. And Chris Kresser is a person who's written very much about this in the human field. You produce autoimmune thyroid disease by gliadin intolerance, antibodies against gliadin from glutens. Now, never mind the glyphosate that those grains have been grown on and whatever. So the problem is...
Will the glyphosates affect the thyroid as well?
Glyphosates cause cancer, they cause brain defects, they can cause endocrine disruption, absolutely. Okay. So what happens is, the ideal food is a homemade, GMO, non-GMO, all natural, human-grade ingredients. Most people don't have the time for that. So what they're doing is they're feeding these cereal foods. Now, the paleo diet, the ancient diet, is a fine one because they did have. But what happened is the dog became domesticated, probably arising from the Eurasian gray wolf, over time, and there's quite a lot of work on that, by the way, done recently. And what they found was the dog changed from the wolf genome to have 3 additional genes that allow them to digest starch. So the domesticated dog is genomically altered to deal with starch, but it has to be the right starch.
Right.
So and that's part of the problem.
Also is a certain amount. And we're probably way overdoing what their capacity for that is.
Right. Well, are you going to buy a commercial food when the very first ingredient is corn gluten meal?
I won't. I mean, but
No,
but don't get me
it's just
wrong.
an example.
When I was younger and when I was growing up, and we didn't really have this explosion of like all the natural foods, the raw foods, all of the different, um, much more. I want to say designer, but I mean, I actually have to go back to the fact that it's just more original diets. But we didn't have all of this 25,
Correct.
30 years ago. You know what I mean? So the supermarket literally was the place where you got your food. And I also don't think that we had a lot of the other factors. I don't think that glyphosate was being sprayed as much as it is nowadays. I don't think that, the animals were getting as many vaccines as they were getting. It was just, it's
all of these things are additive and cumulative.
Yeah.
That's correct. Yeah, so we have to think about that, and we have to think about, now the huge controversy going on right now, and I'm just writing a review on that, is that raw diets aren't safe because you get bacteria contamination and whatever. That's ridiculous. All of the recalls except the last one were from dry kibble diets.
Exactly.
Food is not sterile.
No.
So you say, well, it's not safe to have a raw food, dog food, in a home when you have infants or immunocompromised people or older people. Well, heck, it's the same thing if you have raw chicken that you're chopping up for dinner in your house.
Exactly.
It's got the same risk of contamination. So this is almost the nutrition mafia trying to control common sense, I hate to say that word.
No, but I'm a huge one in terms of common sense, because I literally think, like, when Elvis left the building, so did common sense, because there's just certain things that you go, you mentioned about the planet and everything that's going on. And it's like, common sense would dictate, if you don't want to get cancers, don't put poison in your air, in your food, and in your water, or in your body. So that's we don't need science to actually prove that. Common sense would just tell you, well, if you think you're going to probably get sick from it, don't take it. Like, why would you put a chemical into a perfectly healthy body?
Exactly.
The thing that's so fascinating to me, you just said it about like the nutritional mafia, right? Where does that come? I mean, because I know that they do, like, if you have a Purina or a Science Diet, or even a lot of these larger companies, okay, they all have their facilities and they feed their dogs these nutritional diets and all this stuff, and so that's what they're basing their science on. But what's the deal there? Is it really the absolute truth on diet and nutrition, or is it about money?
Well, no. First of all, when I say the mafia, there's a vaccine mafia, there's a dermatology, there's a mafia. What we're talking about is big business, and it's their job to sell their products, and the people that work for them are paid to promote the product. There's a lot of research that goes on in these companies. Absolutely. They do a lot of research. The question is whether they're asking the right questions for us, the consumer. That's where the common sense comes in. This is a multi-billion-dollar, you got 22 billion in foods and 16 billion in supplements and treats. I mean, that's a huge market. Yeah. So how can the average consumer have any idea what to do? They don't know. They're taking advice from their veterinarian. Their veterinarian may be promoting prescription-type diets because that's what they've been exposed to.
Exactly.
Does that mean that that's going to be the best diet if it's not gluten-free, et cetera, et cetera? If it's got hot, pro-inflammatory meat like chicken or venison in it, we don't want that if the animal's got chronic infections. Right. So we don't teach animal nutrition. There are lots of board-certified nutritionists who do a great job, and many of them work for these companies, and that's fine. But the average clinical veterinarian is not exposed to much other than the lectures that are given, sponsored by big industry, when they're students or graduate students or whatever. Okay. So they don't know. And when you talk to them, when I talk to them in a logical way, they get it. Mm-hmm. That's why the alternative food and alternative medicine movement is growing so much, because people want to use it as an adjunct to conventional medicine. Traditional medicine is alternative, what we call alternative medicine today, what happened for decades ago. Right. So the right medicine, and I believe that, and surgery for certain things, and certain kinds of cancer therapies are necessary. We need to combine the two to make a better, wholesome approach to health.
Okay, so let's circle that back to, so we have the food piece and we have the vaccine piece, which are going to definitely potentially affect thyroid. One of the things that I deal with on a regular basis as a trainer is in terms of tools. And when I started working with my chocolate lab like 25 years ago, you know, the thing was like you use a choke chain. That just, it's just what, I don't know why, it just, that's what it was, right? And back then, there wasn't, you give your dog a treat. There was like, if you give your dog a treat, you're going to be struck down by lightning, okay? But even like the regular collars, like this whole notion of something around the neck, as I started to study more about massage and as I started to study more about canine anatomy and physiology, I was like, you know, there's a lot of delicate stuff in there. And I saw the effects because there were different times like when my dog, you know, would land up hacking. There were different times when we used the nose halter and he tried to scratch it off his neck and, you know, popped out a couple of cervical vertebrae. And thank God I knew about chiropractic. So when I touched his neck and he screamed, I said, he's got to go to the chiropractor. But what I notice overall in my field of training is that there's we kind of understand from an outer perspective, right, what's going on. Well, yeah, that tool could be a little harsh to the neck or the throat. But very few people in my industry are really, really aware of the actual insides. Like when I teach, I always teach about the actual anatomy and physiology in there because you can't physically see it. Right? You're used to seeing the outside and you're used to a strong dog that's pulling you. So you're more concerned usually about stopping the behavior, but not fully understanding what this can actually affect short-term and long-term. So can you talk with us about what you started seeing and what you started noticing in tools and then what you started seeing as an actual correspondence of, hey, when this happens, this is what can actually happen down the road. Because I noticed a lot of the times we have very short-term pieces. We'll say one little thing, but I started watching the long-term effects and I was like, whoa.
Well, we started actually, my first interest in what was going on in the neck and the jaw was from animals that had their salivary duct ruptured. And so they were constantly having saliva or their tearing was wrong because the submandibular lymph nodes and the salivary glands are right under the ear. And I noticed that in show dogs, when you have the small jewelry chain with the ring, it was always on the side that the ring was, because when you get them to go into the show ring, I had sporting dogs and I would do that, the ring would be right there. And I thought, oh my God, if they're trying to pull, let's say they see something that distracts them in the ring, they're going to pull and that ring is going to go smack right there, you know, on that part of the neck. But, Then I started thinking about what else was in the neck, and I realized the thyroid gland was in the neck. And I thought, you know, we're using prong collars and you know, chain collars with heavy links and whatever, especially for dogs that were misbehaving when they're young, and people couldn't control them. Right. So then when I was in Europe, I met a wonderful lady named Else Witz in Belgium, and she teaches animal behavior like you do, for energy. And she taught about all the structures in the neck of the dog that are damaged by collars. And she has an incredible, like a brochure that we actually give out at Hemopet now to show people the drawings that she has about where the thyroid gland is and what happens. And then we have people like Peter Tobias in Vancouver talking about it as well. He was a former person I've known for many years, and before he went into his private work, he was a diagnostic clinic for Hemopet, with Hemopet. And then I realized that we need to change this, and so we've changed everything to harnesses that are loose enough under the forearms so they don't constrict all the nerves and vessels under the arm. And so that's much, much better. I have an example, if you don't mind. We had a group-winning Irish setter, drop dead gorgeous. The people came to me because in one of his recent shows with the jewelry chain now, he growled at the judge and he was excused. Well, they were devastated. They have a professional handler. They brought the dog to see me, and I noticed something weird. His back was a little bit roached. In other words, he didn't have a beautiful, smooth top line, which, of course, would be a no-no in the show ring. And I said, there's something very strange. Tell me, the wife is crying. The husband's got the dog on the couch, and I said, can I just go beside him and check him? So I leant myself over close to the dog's face and ears and talked to him nicely. And on the left side, and he let me touch him and feel him, I leaned over him to go near his right side, and he went, mm. I said, wait a minute, something is wrong with the right side of this dog. He hurts there. So he x-rayed him, and he had a tiny fracture crack on the right side of his cervical vertebra. And that's what happened from being pulled around the show ring. The chain was on that side, as it turned out. And of course, they put him in a special brace to let it heal, because you couldn't do surgery. And he was fine. And it was the roaching in his back that told me that he's got some discomfort.
Absolutely.
And that's how we found it out.
The dogs had showed me how to, I've studied Qigong and traditional Chinese medicine for a long time.
Right.
And so I was fascinated with how they do how they labeled their back assessment points. And while I was studying Chinese medicine, I kept trying to get through the book, reading it about the humans.
Right.
And I'd read a page and I would fall fast asleep. And I'd read, and I'm like, this is ridiculous. Then I found Dr. Cheryl Schwartz's book, 4 Paws, 5
Right. Yeah, she's lovely.
Yeah, she had the back point assessment, and the dogs just kind of said, listen, start testing our backs. So I start testing backs, and I start realizing, wait a minute, you're not like what would be classified as injured, or you have to go to the vet, but you actually have unrecognized pain here. And,
right.
And so I would ask the humans are like, oh no, we massage the dog all the time.
Right.
And all of these were always correlating with behavior issues.
Right.
If it was extreme fear, it was aggression, strange behavior, skittishness. So in just checking the back points and doing a little bit of muscle release, I started to notice immediately when the dog was tight and they couldn't breathe,
right,
it was affecting the central nervous system, and they were way more overstimulated. As soon as that was released, the dog was like,
thank God.
I don't really have a problem, right?
Yeah,
so they started showing me this piece, and then when I started reading about your research with the thyroid piece, it started making sense to me, because there's so many dogs that land up being choked, not necessarily intentionally.
No, of course not.
But because the people are like, I'm not sure how to get them, to walk on leash.
You know what the Irish said? I referred the people to an animal communicator.
Yeah.
And she talked to the dog, and he said, I feel fine now, I'm healed, but I do not want to go into that show ring anymore. I don't like that environment. So they said they retired him.
Yeah. And that's, I started 22 years ago doing animal communication. And then I eventually landed up in the holistic dog training, because I started seeing the connecting of the dots of all of these pieces. And I especially with the thyroid piece, that's what literally led me to creating a harness that, clips at the base of the chest, but that also leaves totally open range of motion.
Right.
And I was like, you have to follow the animal's physiology. You can't just do stuff like put a strap across the front because you're like, well, this will stop them. I'm like, yeah, but it also stops their range of motion.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's those pieces. But what's interesting is watching now, question about the thyroid too. Do you notice in terms of behavior issues that when the thyroid is off balance, that you will start seeing like, a little more like sort of ADD type behaviors, or a little more like nervous type, like it's almost like the dog can't fully ground
Oh, it's all kinds of things. They can't focus. It affects their cognition, it affects their memory, it affects their temperament in terms of they're more anxious all the time. And so we use flower. I have two holistic colleagues that work with us at our holistic center at Hemopat, and one of them is a Chinese medicine expert, by the way, and does laser and acupuncture and whatever. And we're doing all these things. We use calming herbs. We use lavender, for example. We do things to take the anxiety off, and then we have to teach the people in the household. Lavender is a perfect thing because then everybody in the house is calm as well.
Exactly.
So they're not worried as much anymore.
Exactly. So even so we talked about choke collars, we talked about prong collars. What about even the regular collar? I mean,
well, you know, like for our greyhounds that we rescue, they're because they're like an Afghan, they have to have a special sighthound collar. So we use very soft, wide nylon kind of sighthound collars, and we use a harness as well. So if they're really, really rambunctious, they use the harness for control, and then the other is just to help them with their. So it's a very soft thing, and it works well.
Okay, and are you seeing less issue when you were using harnesses?
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
Absolutely.
We don't want them to use regular collars. We've never have. We didn't have the harnesses we didn't promote the harnesses as much as we do now in the last year or so, but we've got some wonderful harnesses. There's a company that even makes a specific greyhound type harness, which has a double harness in the back because they're so long, you know, their chest is so long, the rib spring is so long. So we definitely, and they're expensive, but we tell people, look, you've got this animal for the rent. Don't buy it when it's a puppy, you know, use a simple harness. And then when you get to be adult size, buy a really, really good sturdy one.
Awesome. I mean, I love, like I said, I love layering in. A lot of the times I go by my gut, I go by the common sense pieces, I go by anatomy. And then all of a sudden it comes into, and here's the science. Is that something too that I know that in my industry with the dog training, there are a lot of trainers that will hear nothing unless, where's the scientific research? But you mentioned that you use an animal communicator.
Right.
So the whole notion of animal communication opens another door to how animals actually communicate, because it's not always by they did this because of that and they have awarenesses, they think in pictures, they really respond and react more to the emotion of feeling.
But so do plants and insects and whatever. We had an entire day of lectures at our holistic meeting in San Diego this year from Richard Mandelbaum, who talks about zoopharmacology, how wild animals learn what to do to treat themselves when they're not well.
Yeah.
You know,
and also how they train each other. And sometimes the ways that they train each other, science just can't measure it yet.
Correct.
So a question for you as a researcher, as a bona fide scientist that says basically these are the facts, are there times when science, that there's the quantum field, that things are happening within that we can't fully measure exactly at the time just yet, but does it make them any less valid, or is it sometimes science still has to catch up to what the energy is?
Yeah, I think all of those are correct, but I think the important thing is to look at the background of the person who's teaching these functions before they become actual de facto science, or they're quasi-science at this point, or partial science. You have to look at who they are. For example, I follow Jerry Ryan at St. Francis of Assisi in Northern California, and she works with people with these conditions, and she's got a tremendous following and a senior person. So as far as I'm concerned, she's an expert. So no matter what's been published on what she's doing, she has a gift that I don't have it.
Would you consider that too? So there's the hard sciences, right? Of lab research and stuff.
Right.
Are the observational and the experiential sciences just as valid?
Absolutely. And as a scientist, I mean, I remember years ago, a committee of the National Academy, and we were gathered to determine where veterinary medicine was going in the 1990s. And so we were there in the late 80s. And I remember getting a lecture from the director of the Institute of Medicine, who said, remember, you're here as experts. Experiential science and medicine and clinical experience is as valid as experts as the published scientific fact. That's why we have you here. We want you to predict where we're going, what we're doing based on your experience. And he was right.
I so appreciate that, because in my field, particularly, if I speak anything about energy, right, and even the energy of the thyroid, right, like this caller is pressing on that thyroid, you could be doing damage and not realizing it.
Correct.
The whole notion of saying anything about the observation of how energy is actually moving and working, you could get really, at least in my industry, you could get really vilified for this. And,
but are they following the chi? Where is it flowing? Uh-huh.
They don't know about the chi. I mean, and this is that piece too of why I love speaking with you and why I wanted to interview you. Not for me to prove any kind of point, but just to say, you know, Dr. Jean, you've been doing this for 50 years, right? Mm-hmm. And by all technical means, given what science has been, you should be a very technical person. And yet there was something that you saw beyond just the clinical study. You started seeing these bigger pictures and you started seeing these connections. And that was the reason, because I was like, okay, I am not a trained scientist, but I am definitely an observationalist, and I just have been observing certain things.
Even before the field of nutrigenomics or pharmacogenomics, those names were coined, mm-hmm. I realized that the optimal nutrition for an individual person or animal depends on their genetic background. And I knew that, and I wrote about it before we even had the terms in 2003. I wrote about it in 1998 or 1999, and we have 4 patents talking about that concept, long before it was even known.
This is off the topic of the thyroid, but as a person that started in traditional veterinary medicine and was taught very specific rules and guidelines and science, what was it in you personally that, you know, started opening up to like even what you said at the beginning, you know, where everyone was looking at it a certain way and you said, wait a second, what I'm seeing is a bigger picture here.
Yeah.
What was that in you?
It didn't make sense. It didn't make sense. And I think what happens is the person that controls all of us up in the sky said, you know what? Open your eyes, Jean. I'm going to show you something. I'm going to lead you on a path to teach others what you're seeing, even if you don't have any idea what it means at the time.
To me, that is why I absolutely adore you, because you have done the clinical work and you have said, okay, you've taught me, you've told me that this is what it is. And I am also open to being shown something larger. Yeah. That the science is great and it's going to show me certain building blocks, but it isn't the whole picture. But I'm still going to stay within the science. I'm just going to also stay open to the bigger picture. Reminds me of like Albert Einstein. Do you know what I mean? Because,
oh wow, what amazing person he was, right?
Right, but how much was he a scientist? Mm-hmm. And then through science, how much did it also show him like, whoa, I had no idea.
You know, the Albert Einstein statue at the National Academy is there when I was telling you about this. And we actually, in 1974, with special private funding, had the first conference in the National Academy Central Room about animal care and use committees, where a public member had to sit on those committees to represent what the public said. And the people, I was the moderator of that meeting, the people there, the scientists and whatever, said, oh, we don't want to listen to the public. What do they have to do? I said, you're wrong. We're going to listen to the public. And it was Christine Stevens from the Animal Welfare Institute that got up and explained what the public had to deal with it. And ever since then, the law was passed that requires a public member, not associated with the university or whatever, to be on every institutional animal care and use committee to represent what the public needs to understand about and know about. That was amazing. It was totally amazing. And people started clapping at the end.
And right now, what the public needs to know and understand about how to best serve their dogs in terms of training situations. I mean, are you okay with a collar being on a dog for tags, but just utilize a harness if you're going to do any kind of
training? Sure.
Okay.
Of course.
Awesome. Well, there's a whole other subject that I want to talk to you about in terms of vaccines, because you have so much pioneering research on it. So can we schedule another interview to talk to our viewers about vaccines and just help educate them so they can actually make the highest choice? Because I know too, when I go to the vet and they're like, where are your vaccine records? I'm like, well, they were vaccinated when they were puppies. And they're sort of like, what do you mean? And I'm like, well, one dog got bitten by a black widow spider, and the other dog had a big bump when he got a rabies vaccine. So we're good with vaccine, but it's also too, for me, only because of your research, that I have felt comfortable enough making a choice that I feel comfortable with to make those choices and to make sure that things are done in a gentler way. So would you come back and can we do an interview on vaccines?
Sure, happy to do that.
Awesome. You're a tour de force, and I'm so grateful to know you, and I'm so grateful that you have been willing to trust your gut, literally, and to follow what the path that the being up in the sky has been showing you. Yes. Because it's changed a lot of lives. And so your website is hemopet.org. .org. So if people also too, in terms of vaccines, if they want the scientific based research, they can ask their vet to take a titer and the blood work to Hemopet, so you can analyze whether your dog is still in the safe range for vaccine.
Right. All the major laboratories do titers today, but they're not all quantitative. So you need to do a quantitative one, which like the one we do. And we basically started that in the year 2000 was the first titer study in a refereed scientific publication that Lisa Twark and I did, 17,000 cases of where we looked at them all, and then we picked 1,500 or so for the publication.
Okay, and then in terms of thyroid issues, if you suspect at all that your dog might be having thyroid issues, and please remember, like Dr. Dodds said, thyroid issues are happening at earlier and earlier and earlier ages. So if you land up with your vet saying, no, your dog's too young for thyroid, but you have a gut feeling that it could be a thyroid potentiated issue, can they also send in blood work?
Yes, we're the only ones that do age and breed specific norms, and our patented thyroid assays do not use radioisotopes because they're not a North American technology. They're European technology, a trade secret, because we didn't want to contaminate the earth. But if you insist that it's my dollar, doctor, please humor me and do these assays. And what happens then, if the owner was right, and they nearly always are, the veterinarian now has learned something very important. And so the bottom line is they're saving other animals because they're now going to take this approach and apply it to their other patients. So that's really a win-win-win all around.
Okay, awesome. And then in terms of dog training with thyroids, we're okay with collars around the neck for tags.
Right.
But truthfully, anytime you don't want to have any kind of like pulling or yanking or any type of pressure on the neck. Harnesses, front clip harnesses, and hopefully too, not only does the harness stop the dog from pulling, but hopefully one of the things, and I'll ask you about this next time, is one of the things I've noticed with dogs that can't relax, they're constantly in a hyperadrenal state.
Right.
I'm assuming that can't be very good for the overall like health and sound
no, it's not.
And functioning.
It's not, We have to calm those animals, right? And we use things like Tellington touch, where we massage behind the ears. We look at the animal straight away and look in their eyes and tell them verbally that we're there to help them, that we're a team.
Yep.
And if the animal doesn't want to be around anymore, they'll tell you with their eyes, if they're chronically ill.
Definitely.
Whereas if they have a joy and life in them. They say, please help me. We'll work together because I want to stay here.
Yes.
More.
Yes.
Right.
And animal communication is actually awesome for that.
Right.
It's one of the things that I deal a lot with my clients on, because especially end of life situations, you know, we think that it's our responsibility. Does the dog live or die? And I'm always like, just ask the dog.
Yeah.
You know, or the horse.
Give them dignity, give them quality of life. Yes.
Yes, and understand that they also have a consciousness. That it's not, you're just helping them choose what their choice is. And when my clients do not have to take on that burden of, oh my God, I put my dog down. There's so much more peace, and literally the beauty and the exquisiteness of the crossing over process actually gets to be experienced as a exquisitely joyous. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's hard and it's sad to lose our animals, no question. But the actual process, just like birth is beautiful, the crossing over process can be just as exquisite, and people get gifted with much bigger awareness of heart and the soul connection.
And peace. Yeah.
So much more. So awesome.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
And we look forward to our next conversation about vaccines.
Okay. Thanks very much. Yes.
You're welcome. So this is Alicia Evans, the Animal Healer. Thank you so much for tuning in to In Sync with Animals. If you are having any leash training, walking, behavior issues, you can also visit walkinsync.com and check out our harness and leash-based system, which helps make walking and training super easy and super understandable on both sides of the leash. Dr. Jean, we adore you, and please keep doing what you're doing, and anything that we can do to spread the word and spread the message. Also, too, can I also have the website for yours and Diana's work on the thyroid protocols and foods? I think that's extraordinarily important for many people, even though we're dealing with dog training, because the thyroid balance will absolutely, in my opinion, affect, and it can affect training. Can we have that information?
Yeah, it's myhealthydog.dog.
Okay, myhealthydog.dog. If you have any thyroid-based issues, not only do you want to check it with your veterinarian, but Dr. Jean and Diana's book will also help you step by step thoroughly understand the whole entire process of the thyroid, what it does, how it works, how it functions, and also how to feed. Because that's one thing on an everyday basis that we do have the ability to monitor and to support our dogs with really healthy diets. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
We look forward to talking with you again.
Great, thanks. Bye-bye.